Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, wherever you might be. My name is Carol O'Donnell, and I'm the director of the Smithsonian Science Education Center. Welcome to the session called Convergence Education, a framework to help K-12 STEAM educators teach about real-world, transdisciplinary problems and phenomenon. And I'm joined here by many of my colleagues, which will be introduced to shortly. The objectives for today, on the next slide, we'll be learning about the Federal Agency Working Group on Convergence Education. And each one of us that you're going to meet today, we're all members of that interagency working group, where all of these different federal agencies, are about 16 or 17 of us, who are collaborating around STEM education. And we serve on a working group called the Interagency Working Group on Convergence Education. We will describe ways that these federal agencies are working together to advance science, technology, engineering, arts, and math education, so STEM/STEAM education and even beyond. We'll discuss what's needed to help students address deep scientific questions and societal needs. And we will review research on convergence. So where did this concept of convergence education come from? We'll define transdisciplinary teaching and learning and apply it to convergence education. And we'll review classroom examples from two K-12 teachers, Kelly Day and Trey Smith, who are with us today. And we'll talk about how to achieve a pathway to convergence in your STEAM classroom. We'll reflect on your learning, and then with the help of our colleague, Patti Curtis from the U.S. Department of Education, and then Dr. Jorge Valdes will close us out, reflecting on what the big key takeaways are from this particular session, and you'll receive links to several free federal resources that promote transdisciplinary learning and convergence education. Now, we'll structure the day or the time, an introduction from our colleague, Dr. Jedidah Isler from the Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House. We hope that she's able to join us. If not, I'll carry you through that section. We'll talk about convergence education and give you a broad overview that's based on the convergence research that came out of the National Science Foundation. We will give you, as I mentioned, from Kelly and Trey, classroom examples of convergence education. Patti Curtis will help us with assessing our understanding. And then finally, with the help of Dr. Valdez, we'll engage in closing remarks and share with you teaching resources. So throughout this session, we're going to try to do this. It's not going to be easy, but we're going to engage in interactive engagement where we'll ask you a question, and then we hope that you're able to respond to that question using the question and answer box that's on the events page right under our session. Now, there's about a 20-second delay between the time that I will ask the question and you enter your responses and we actually get them. So please bear with us as we try to do this seamlessly. Our first question, and oh, by the way, if you're on a mobile device or a mobile phone and you can see us and our slides, you will not be able to see the Q&A box. So if you can, either grab a second phone or go to your computer if you have access to it and go back to the events page and put your question in on a separate device. If not, we hope that we can share with you the responses from others. So the first question, and all you have to do is enter into the Q&A box, the answer box, a number, one single number. So how familiar are you with the concept of convergence education? Have you ever heard of that word before? So put a 1 in there if you've never heard of that term at all. Put a 2 if you're somewhat familiar with it, you've heard it, but you're not sure really though if it's happening at your school. A 3 if you're familiar with it, you've heard the term convergence and even convergence education. You know teachers who are using convergence education, but you've never really applied it in your own classroom. And then finally, very familiar, put a 4 in there. You consider yourself an advocate or an expert in convergence education and you apply it all the time. All right, so let's take a look at some of the responses. And it looks like most of you are saying a 1 or 2. So not familiar with convergence education, maybe somewhat familiar with the word convergence, but don't really know whether it's happening in your school. And we hope that by the end of this session, that you actually do see yourself in and do understand that convergence education actually is happening at your school. All right, so the second question. So this time we're going to ask you to put a letter in. And again, the reason a letter, not a number, is because we want to differentiate the questions. So now we're going to ask you, how often do you teach about transdisciplinary real-world problems and phenomena in your classrooms? Forget about convergence, just how often do you think you're teaching about real-world transdisciplinary problems and phenomena? Give you a little bit of time to do that. Put an A, not at all. B, sometimes I teach about real-world problems and phenomena. They're transdisciplinary, cut across disciplines. C, I often do this. Or D, all of the time. It's the framework that I use for all of my teaching practices. So let's look at the responses. All right, so we see, it looks like most of the responses are between B and C. So even though you weren't teaching through convergence education, B and C. So sometimes I'm teaching transdisciplinary problems, real world problems and phenomena, or more often I'm doing this. So that's great. All right, so now I have the pleasure of turning it over to our dear colleague from the Office of Science and Technology Policy, Dr. Jedidah Isler. She is the lead of the Science and Society Division at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy as the Principal Assistant Director. The Science and Society team advances the President's commitment to ensuring that all of America can participate in, contribute to, and benefit from science and technology. An inaugural White House team, the Science and Society team directs priority efforts to protect the integrity of science in the federal government, to broaden participation in STEM fields, to strengthen the U.S. research infrastructure and its security, and to ensure that all Americans have equitable access to the benefits of new and emerging technologies and scientific innovation. Dr. Isler brings her expertise as an astrophysicist, an expert in supermassive black holes, science communicator, founder, and vocal advocate for the rightful presence of women of color, non-binary people of color, and marginalized groups more broadly in science and technology. She served on the Astronomy and Astrophysics Decadal Survey, inaugural State of the Profession and Society Impacts Panel, was a member of the American Institute of Physics Team Up Task Force to advance African Americans in physics and astronomy, for which she was awarded the 2022 American Physical Society Excellence in Physics Education Award. She delivered 2 TED Talks and was one of the astrophysics faculty at Dartmouth College immediately before beginning her public service at the White House. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Isler. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh my goodness, thank you, Carol, so much for that very kind introduction, and happy local time, everyone. As Carol said, my name is Jedidah Isler, and I am delighted to be with you today. Thanks so much also for that interactive feedback. It's good to know that there's great opportunity to learn more about convergence today. So thanks everybody for participating there. It's great to be with you, this incredible set of educators today. As you heard, as a former or paused, lapsed, I don't know, astrophysics professor in a previous life, I know how important your roles are to training the next generation of innovators. You are in for an engaging workshop today about convergence education, and I hope you'll find it useful as you prepare to start another school year. My goodness. But before you all dive in, we thought it would be good to provide a bit of background and context for why the federal government is thinking about convergence education. So over a decade ago, Congress released the 2010 Competes Reauthorization Act in an effort to improve the coordination and collaboration across federal agencies around STEM education. And through this act, Congress required the federal government to publish a strategic plan to carry out this work every 5 years. The first strategic plan was called the Federal Science, Technology, Engineering, and Mathematics Education 5-Year Strategic Plan, very creative. It was published in 2013. It included 5 priority areas, such as K-12 STEM instruction, public and youth engagement, undergraduate education, graduate education, and efforts to broaden participation of historically underrepresented groups. The current plan, titled Charting a Course for Success, America's Strategy for STEM Education, was published in 2018 with a continued interest in providing our country's learners a high-quality STEM education. Next slide, please. These federal strategic plans were created by the National Science and Technology Council's Committee on STEM Education, with input from individuals with our federal agencies and from the public, including educators such as yourselves. Once the strategy is finalized and publicly released, federal agencies each work to carry out the work through interagency working groups made up of representatives from across various federal science agencies to implement the strategy for the next 5 years. Today, you'll learn from members of the Convergence Interagency Working Group. Next slide, please. The 2018 plan outlined a vision for its work focused on lifelong access to quality STEM education and includes aspirational goals of building foundations for lifelong STEM literacy, preparing the future STEM workforce, and increasing diversity, equity, and inclusion in STEM. Next slide, please. The current plan also includes 4 pathways that you can consider the how the federal agencies were asked to come together to achieve this plan's goals. One of those pathways is actually about convergence, because it is through convergence where the discrete disciplines across science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and computer science come together to enable us to solve not only the complex problems of today, but those that we have yet to encounter. You're going to learn much more about convergence education in the rest of today's session. But before I go, let me say 2 things. 1, thank you so much for your hard work and dedication to your communities, your schools, and your students. We owe you more than we could ever repay for the work you have done and are doing, the work you have done and are doing to prepare the nation's young people. 2, your connection and engagement to this work and our efforts don't stop here. CoSTEM will create a new strategic plan soon. And like before, we look forward to hearing your thoughts on where, as a country, as a community, and as educators, we should focus our efforts next. So please stay in touch, be on the lookout for ways to share your thoughts. And once our new strategic plan is released, to join our efforts in making STEM more accessible for all. Thank you for your time and enjoy the session. Back over to you, Carol.
Jedidah, thank you so much for your inspirational words and for providing that foundation for everyone around the incredible effort led by the Office of Science and Technology Policy. Thank you for your leadership.
Thank you.
So on the next slide, now we're going to begin to talk to you about the foundations of convergence education. And I'm going to be providing an overview on behalf of my colleague, Dr. Emily Kuhn, who is not able to join us today. Much of this work, thanks to Emily as the executive secretary of this interagency working group. Next slide. So I want to just ask a question of you. Again, please feel free to use the chat, the answer function, if you can, to answer this question. What deep scientific questions and societal needs do our students face? Those are 2 different things, but we're going to begin to see that overlap. And that's where this idea of transdisciplinary teaching and learning will come from. So in this Q&A, what deep, before we link to the next level, what deep scientific questions and societal needs do our students face? So let's, before clicking through anything else, let's just think, is there anything that you want to add to the Q&A? All right, so some of you wrote climate change. And we've seen quite a few sessions about that already today at the National Education Summit. Others wrote just education in general is a deep societal need. All right, so continue to put your thoughts in the chat. Or into the answer box. So some of the ways that these are couched by the UN, the United Nations, and others who have looked at this very question, what deep scientific questions, societal needs do our students face? They've categorized them into two levels. The first are those societal needs. So for example, you see here, poverty, the digital divide, social justice, education, migration, maritime safety. In addition, we have deep scientific questions that we need to ask and that many of our students today are addressing. Some of you said this in the chat, climate change, biodiversity loss. We're living through a pandemic right now. So infectious disease, water scarcity, energy security, food security, being able to make certain that people have access to food, fishery depletion, and deforestation. Are we educating our students to understand these complex socio-scientific issues of our time? So while many of us might be science teachers, we're starting to recognize that it's not just science we're teaching, we're also teaching about these deep societal questions, and that we need technology, engineering, math, and other disciplines in order to answer those questions. Next slide. So when we think about these complex socio-scientific challenges and priorities, there are attributes that they have in common, and they end up to be the foundation for convergence education. So if you think about this, and again, we'll try to use this answer box if you can, what do you believe is needed to help students address these challenges and to help students find these solutions? So what do you believe is needed to help students address complex socio-scientific issues and to find solutions to those issues? We'll give you a few minutes to put your answers in the Q&A. One of you is saying fake news versus false news, right? This idea of misinformation, disinformation, malinformation. How do we as teachers try to address the challenges that we face by students having access to information that is not necessarily accurate, and at times is intentionally trying to create a false narrative? Also, this challenge between STEM and STEAM. Yesterday, I attended an amazing 2 days ago session, not for this summit, but another one called the Action Planning Institute from our center, that focused on STEM versus STEAM. And they talked about how the A is not necessarily just the arts, but it's history, culture, religion, community. It's finding that A access point for students to be able to address these complex challenges. So STEM has to be accessible to people through those other areas of arts, religion, history, culture. Access to professionals in the field. Some of you said scientific literacy, the fact that students need research skills, the intersection of political versus religious positioning and science. And then finally, environments that spark curiosity. So lots of great responses in the chat of what is needed to help students address these complex socio-scientific challenges and find solutions. All right, so the next slide. So what is convergence? We're going to look at 3 primary characteristics that actually came from the National Science Foundation when they were defining convergence. The first is that convergence is driven by a specific and compelling problem. It's inspired by the need to address a specific challenge or opportunity, whether it arises from a deep scientific phenomenon, an engineering problem, or a pressing societal need. So researchers engage in convergence research based on these specific compelling problems. The second characteristic that's based on convergence research but is applied to education is that, as we heard from your entries, it has deep integration across multiple disciplines. It's complex, addressing socio-scientific problems, not just scientific problems. It cannot be solved just by looking at them through one lens, one mindset, one perspective. Experts from different disciplines must work together and blend their knowledge, experts, and data to create comprehensive solutions. And finally, number 3, it's transdisciplinary. And that means, and we'll talk to you later about what that means, it is creating a new framework for teaching, a new paradigm, and disciplines form across multiple communities. The next slide. So what do we mean by transdisciplinary? According to the document that Jedidah shared with us from the White House, transdisciplinary is defined in this way: problems that are relevant to people's lives, communities, or society as a whole often cross disciplinary boundaries, making them inherently engaging and interesting. The transdisciplinary integration of STEM/STEAM teaching and learning across different fields and with other fields such as the humanities and the arts, history, culture, enriches all fields and draws learning to authentic problems from local and global in scale. This image that you see beneath kind of demonstrates that, and Kelly and Trey are going to talk more about that later. Intra-disciplinary or disciplinary means you just have one single discipline. Multidisciplinary, multiple disciplines are being addressed, but separately. Cross-disciplinary, these disciplines or interdisciplinary are starting to overlap. And then finally, transdisciplinary, the disciplines are so merged that you can't even tell them apart. Now, one of our colleagues, Joanne Vasquez, who used to be the head of the National Science Teaching Association, wrote a book called STEM Lesson Essentials, and Kelly and I worked closely with her, as did Patti and Jorge, and she shared with us this graphic from one of her books called STEM Lesson Essentials, in which she defines disciplinary, multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary in terms of STEM teaching. So disciplinary, students learn concepts and skills separately and in isolation. Multidisciplinary, students learn concepts and skills separately in each discipline, like math and science, but there's a common theme across the two. Interdisciplinary, now the teachers are working together and 2 or more disciplines are tightly linked around a particular knowledge or skill. And then finally, transdisciplinary, where you're trying to undertake real world problems, explain real world phenomena. Students are applying that knowledge and skills from 2 or more disciplines to help shape the learning experience. And you probably couldn't define what disciplines actually, what discipline, singular discipline is being addressed. And Kelly and Trey will give you great examples of that in a few minutes. Now, convergence should be 3 things, according to the National Research Council, now the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. First, it should be integral, not a replacement. In other words, strong foundational disciplines are still essential. Second, it should be intentional and explicit. Effective convergence education is transdisciplinary. It doesn't just happen, you have to work at it. And finally, it's strategic and measured, quality over quantity. And finally, we have to assess it. And Kelly will talk a little bit about the challenges of how complex it is to assess the outcomes in a transdisciplinary way. So the next slide shows there are different outcomes to assess. And Kelly and Trey will talk about some of those outcomes, whether it's, assessing their STEM literacy, their critical thinking, their STEM identity, their workforce readiness, their career employment, their persistence in STEM careers. There are different ways to assess this, but it's not easy when you might be assigned to a particular discipline in your classroom. So with that, I'm so excited to turn it over to my next colleagues on the next slide. Miss Kelly J. Day, who is our Albert Einstein Distinguished Educator Fellow, so you can go to the next slide, who is also a Fulbright Distinguished Awardee in teaching. She came to us through that Albert Einstein Distinguished Educator Fellow at the U.S. Department of Energy. I have learned so much from Kelly. She and I just published an article on this together in the Smithsonian magazine, so we'll share that link with you later. We're also fortunate to be here thanks to Dr. Jorge Valdez, who works closely with Mr. Trey Smith, who's a K-8 teacher in digital literacy, computer science, and making at Chester Arthur School. So with that, Kelly, Trey, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Carol. What a wonderful overview of convergence education. And as a 7th grade math teacher, I wanted to show you some examples of what this actually looks like in the classroom. So if you go to the next slide, let's just think about the traditional approach to teaching a simple concept in 7th grade math. Tina has a 20 by 15 foot garden in Atlanta, Georgia. You could go the disciplinary route and just find the area of her garden. That would take 2 seconds. The kids would multiply it together, they would move on. It wouldn't really impact their lives or create any questions or engagement in the process. You could take it a step a little bit further and try to bring in a multidisciplinary approach. So if you go to the next one, you could maybe they're doing something in science. They go to math class, they're talking about the area of the garden. Then they go to a science class and they're going to be testing the soil, maybe talking about different climates and what can grow in that soil. And what you're doing there, if you click again, is you're kind of just building different elements. You're having different blocks, different vegetables as you were. Science is still saying science, math is still saying math. It's not really integrated together. It might be on the same topic, but it's not truly starting to blend together for the students. But if you kind of go to the next level, you could try to make it more interdisciplinary. You could say, hey, we're going to design a garden that's suitable to the climate of Atlanta, Georgia. Suddenly you have to use math to find the area of these different types of plants and resources. You're using science to learn about the soil and the climate of the area. You could bring in social studies and say, well, what's the history? What's historically been used in this area in agriculture? And they're starting to blend together, but in this salad, you can still pick out, oh, this is a tomato, this is a lettuce, this is, a cucumber. They're in the same salad, they're mixed together, but you still know which elements you're using at different times. And so it's not reaching true transdisciplinary learning. True transdisciplinary learning is going to blend it all together so that the kids don't even know which subject they're doing as they're solving a problem. So a step closer would be just going in and saying, Tina wants to use her garden to make and sell salsa. Suddenly kids have all kinds of questions. Well, what kind of salsa? What's the recipe? What can we grow in Atlanta, Georgia? Can it be mango salsa, or does the climate not do that? And then you've got innovation and entrepreneurship skills kind of going into that of how are we going to market the salsa? Where are we going to sell it? How much does it cost? What's the volume of the jars we're going to put it in? There's so many new questions and ways that they're going to attack this. But still, to get true transdisciplinary learning, going back to the 3 elements that Carol talked about, it needs to start with a compelling problem. So perhaps you address, how can Tina use her garden to help support her community, those in her community who may be experiencing food insecurities or food scarcity. And so suddenly we're building students' socio-scientific skills. They're tackling a problem that's tangible, and they're going to be using multiple different ways to approach this problem. And they're going to be using science skills, mathematics skills, social studies skills, and entrepreneurial skills all at once, and they don't know when they're using them. And so that's kind of what it looks like. So now if you go to the next slide, it's like, what does this actually look like in the classroom? Well, one, it starts with lots of questions. Like I said, the students are going to be suddenly very invested in this garden and what they can grow there, and how much does a tomato plant yield, and how do we water it? What's going to happen? How do we market this? And so it's so fun to see this. And suddenly, I did this in my classroom, and kids who just couldn't care less about the area of a 20 by 15 foot garden. You multiply it, you move on. They forgot about it 2 seconds later, are suddenly asking me, can I get a tape measure? And they wanted to like literally measure out to visualize how big this garden is going to be. And so it looks messy. If you come into this classroom, you have certain kids working on one aspect of a project, other kids working on a different aspect. And that's great because it's actually then using the skills that the kids have. And it's a kid who maybe their strength may not be mathematics, but they're really good at design, is suddenly in charge of creating the design for the salsa. But guess what? They're going to have to know area, which was the original standard, to find that label. And so, and then they're asking the questions that they're needing to ask who are the people in our community that are facing food insecurities, and how do we get this to them? So it's great, it's fun, it's problem-based learning, a lot of engineering design. This worked, this didn't work. Let's go back to the table and try it a different approach. And so it's just a lot of fun. Now, I know that this is hard in the classroom. I know we are not oblivious to the challenges facing teachers, and time being one issue, training, just the support for this and the assessment elements. But a lot of personal insecurities can come into it. Like, for example, I'm not a botanist. I'm not a specialist in soil. And you know what? It's okay to admit that to your students. They're going to come to you with questions like that you do not know the answer for. And that is a great opportunity to demonstrate a growth mindset to the students of, I don't know that answer, but we can show them the tools of where and how you can look that up. And you can become not experts, but knowledgeable in all of these transdisciplinary topics. And that is the heart of this, because that is what they're going to have to be doing in the real world in their jobs. I don't know about you guys, but most jobs do not do mathematics portion of their job at 9 a.m. and science at 10 a.m. and reading at 11 a.m. And then it's not segmented. It's mixed together. And when you don't know an answer, you find it. And that's what's beautiful about this. So, and again, we're not replacing the standards. We know that you have to have those building blocks. You have to have tomatoes to make salsa. You can't just start with salsa. We're not replacing the standards, but we're using the standards in a way that engages students, that makes it meaningful for them and allows them to utilize those standards in a productive way that makes them realize, oh, this is using the skills that I'm learning in all of these various classes to make my world a better place. And I know that one of the biggest issues too is administrator and district buy-in. We are judged by assessments, unfortunately, as teachers. And, sometimes it's hard to get them to understand how this correlates to the standards that we're supposed to teach. But I think that education and information is key. You guys starting by coming here, learning about it, you can go and share it with your administrators. Hopefully we have some administrator and district leaders in this presentation right now who can take this back to their teachers. And soon we should have some documents and stuff that we can send out to the public to help you educate those in your community, to help you understand what this looks like. But I'm gonna move on to Trey. Trey is a fantastic teacher in Philadelphia. He does amazing things with Makerspace and with his students, and he's got some other examples of what this looks like in the classroom. So thank you, Trey. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. I certainly love learning from you as I'm trying to wrap my head around the possibilities, the potential for convergence education. And one of the things that I'm thinking through, and I think folks on the task force are thinking through as well, is we already have a lot of movements and programs and ways of thinking about STEM education in particular that are already abundant in schools. And, it might be part of the lingo and the discourse in your district. People have been talking about inquiry-based learning for quite a long time, right? And folks are out here doing place-based education in really rich and meaningful ways that allow them to tackle local questions and problems. And that's connected often with project-based learning and problem-based learning. We've seen a real growth in phenomenon-based learning, especially in science education, and then in the career and technical fields with work-based learning and career and technical education. And so I'm looking through a list of all of these different approaches, and I'm tasked with thinking about, okay, so these might exist in your community already, in your school community. So where does convergence fit in? How does it support, how do these different approaches potentially support convergence education? But also, how does convergence education in this framework of transdisciplinary learning push how we might think about career and technical education, or how we might think about the phenomena that we take up in our science classrooms, for instance, where it's suddenly not just a science lens that we're using to unpack a specific phenomenon. And so I think it's really important as we think about convergence education to recognize what's already happening in our schools. What are we already talking about? What are teachers already comfortable with, and also administrators? And then ask ourselves, what's the next level, or what's the push that we're getting as we think about transdisciplinary learning and convergence education? And I think that's something that we have to recognize, that we don't want to just add a new program that replaces things. That's not what we're talking about here. We're saying, no, there are vexing, challenging socioscientific problems out in the world, and local challenges, global challenges. How can we make sure that the questions and the problems and the solutions around these issues are things that we take up, regardless of whether these other, approaches to education are part of our schools or whatnot already? How can we push what we're doing? Next slide, please. The other thing that we should be reflecting on, and it's something that I think about a lot as a teacher who, I'm a K-8 teacher in a makerspace in Philadelphia, and so nobody else in my building is doing what I'm doing. On the other hand, I know so many other teachers in my building are working with the same students, right? And I have colleagues across the city and across the country who are doing similar work or work in specific disciplines. And so how can I learn from them? And I want to think of the different roles that are at play if we're doing these different levels that Carol and Kelly have been talking about. So, if we're in a disciplinary approach, we might stick with our discipline, our department meetings, our people that teach math, or our people that teach science. And we learn to do that work really well and really deeply within a discipline, and that's great. But we also, maybe with a multidisciplinary approach, are starting to work with other teachers to do what might be in an elementary school, like thematic teaching, right? So we're all studying water, but we might be looking at water historically and scientifically and mathematically and so forth. And that can blend into an interdisciplinary approach where we're still working with other teachers, and we're working on real world problems, but still the data is split up and the subjects are split up pretty separately by discipline. And as we move into a transdisciplinary approach, the key is that we're really trying to identify these complex problems and phenomena that just don't exist in one discipline, and we can't tackle them with just one discipline. And as Kelly shared, we might then begin to think, oh gosh, I don't have expertise in all of the ways of knowing that are required to unpack this problem. And so as I think about role of a teacher in convergence education, one of the things that I'm doing is I'm constantly learning and being open, as Kelly said, to saying, I don't know, I'm not sure about that, but let's learn about this together. On the other hand, you are predicting, if you sort of have a phenomenon and a question that you that you and your students are going to take up, you can still predict some of the things that students are going to want to know about, right? And so part of the work that you do is to unpack for yourself what this issue might be. And in doing that unpacking, you're often going to work with other teachers, and you're going to ask them and reflect with them, what kinds of things might I need to know as I unpack this with students. And it's not just about knowing the content, but also really reflecting on, if I take up an issue that's complex like climate or racial discrimination as part of any of these topics, students may be discouraged as we deal with some of these issues. And they might say, gosh, why haven't adults in my life already solved these problems? Why is this a problem that I still need to solve as a young person? I think that's a really fair question, first of all. And second of all, I think that's one of the things that we have to be reflective about as practitioners going into some of these topics, is that there are teachers out there who have been doing this work and who have been reflecting together and can help you reflect on how do we address some of the discouragement that students might face, while highlighting that there are people around the world who have been addressing these issues and who have been making headway, and often those are young people. And so how do we make sure that we lift up the young people, especially who are out here making a difference and offering solutions? And how can we as a class then join this? And so as I think about the role of the teacher, I want to focus on, it's not just all of the disciplinary ideas across disciplines that I need to understand, but it's also really understanding how are young people as people going to be approaching these issues and these topics, and what kinds of things are they going to be sharing with us, and how do we support them? And so in thinking about how we support them, we're going to need to be working and reflecting with other practitioners to do this work. Next slide. So one of the things that is on my mind is a project from this past year that I embarked on with some fabulous fourth graders in my Philadelphia makerspace. And I share this not necessarily as like a finished product or some packaged unit that you could just take and plop into your own classroom. It's one where I think that there's a compelling problem. So we are looking and thinking about what are the environmental impacts of our clothing and fashion industries. The clothes that we wear, how are they made? Where do they go when we're done with them? And also, are there even some environmental impacts of things that we wear while we wash them? And this is a really, I think, complex problem that stretches across science, but also social studies and history and technology, and then also the disciplines that we might use to actually offer up solutions. And so as I'm working with students on this problem, we're trying to first unpack sort of what are some of the issues, right? Well, some of the issues are that we often are making clothes very cheaply. We have social media that influences what we wear and why we wear it. And gosh, if I have a social media account, I don't want to be caught wearing the same thing too often. So I maybe need new clothes for different photos. So thinking about how changes in technology have not only made it possible to make things faster and cheaper, but also have influenced in like what we wear and what we present to other people in the world. Our clothing systems contribute to greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which can drive climate change. We also know that some synthetic fibers can introduce microplastics into water systems, which can cause all kinds of other problems. And in doing this, we're also reflecting as young people in particular on, how are clothes and how's clothing an important part of who I am? How's it an important part of my identity? How's it an important part of my community, right? So as we unpack this issue from, we might think about it in terms of climate systems or water systems. We're also thinking about it in terms of the social and cultural systems that we participate in, right? We can't just like not have clothes potentially, and we can't just wear the same clothes all the time, or maybe we could, but if we're going to do that, we're going to have to think about what are the social and cultural aspects of what we wear and why we wear it. In doing this work, we're reading news articles, we're looking at historical primary sources to think about how have our systems for purchasing and just learning about new clothes and making clothes, how those changed over time. We're interviewing people in our community, in our lives, whether it's our grandmother who likes to sew things, or whether it's a cousin who's really fashionable and owns an Instagram page where he shows off his latest sneakers. Or I had a student who's reaching out to a company that repurposes shoes and makes them out of recycled materials, and so he's wanting to know more about what they do, and so we crafted an email together to interview someone via Zoom. So we're doing work to understand the issue, but also to learn from people about this issue and what they're doing and how they think about it. And as we're doing this, we're moving across disciplines. I hope that's really clear. And then to think about our solutions, we're engaging in transdisciplinary practices that journalists use by conducting interviews. We're trying to uncover multiple perspectives. we're constructing scripts. And in doing this, we're sharing what we're finding, but we're also, in the spirit of solutions journalism, we're trying to say, okay, so here's what we think is out there in terms of what people are doing to address this issue. And the issue is complicated. We could get into whether we need individual changes versus like systemic changes. We can't just, donate our way out of this in terms of donating clothing, because that doesn't change the system necessarily. On the other hand, we can't dismiss donating clothing as a solution. And so unpacking that. And then we're using digital tools to go public with our arguments. I share this again, not as a unit that's perfect, not as a unit that I think even hits all the benchmarks, but I do think that there are some important things that we're doing where we're trying to tackle a really complex problem. We are using different disciplines, as we look at historical primary sources, or we construct explanatory models, or as we construct interview protocols. We're using disciplinary practices, but we're really trying to wrap our heads around what do we do about a complex problem like the environmental impacts of fashion. So maybe we have some time to talk about this in the Q&A, but thank you so much. And now I'm gonna, on the next slide, introduce the moderator for our next session, Patti Curtis. And I met Patti Curtis years ago as an Einstein Fellow when I was in DC. And Patti now is the Robert Noyce Ellen Letman STEM Education Fellow in the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education at the U.S. Department of Education. It's all yours, Patti.
Thanks, Trey. So good to see you, and I really enjoyed your presentation. I listened to a NPR brief the other day, and they were talking, the person they were interviewing must have listened to the same podcast, because he said he was no longer buying new clothes, and he had bought no new clothes for 2 years. And then the interviewer asked, like, what about socks and underwear? He goes, well, I'll make an exception on occasion. So, and Kelly, your presentation about the salsa, it's so spot on, really brings it to life. Made me a little hungry, but I think everyone's getting ready for lunch soon, perhaps. But thanks, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. I want to welcome all our guests from the Smithsonian Summit, and also our guests from the USPTO Summit. So I think we're double dipping, which is great that so many people are interested in convergence education. So I know Carol alluded to a quiz or an assessment. So I have the great joy of being the teacher right now. And I want you to know that we have 5 questions that we would really love your feedback on. So the first question is, knowing that, the original questions were like, there was not a lot of awareness around convergence education as you entered this session. So now, after hearing these great examples, sort of the history of how we got here and some of the teachers' examples, how familiar do you feel you are with this concept of convergence education? And we're asking you to just type in a number, 1 being, I'm still really confused, not at all. I still don't really understand what and how I would implement this. And then number 2 would be, I'm somewhat familiar, I understand, but I'm not sure I could apply it in my classroom. Number 3 would be that I am familiar and I feel better about this now, and I'm pretty sure I could do this in the classroom and I'm excited about it. And then number 4 would be, you're very familiar, you understand this, you're already doing this, you'd have things to share, you want to be an advocate within your own building, and perhaps conduct future webinars on convergence education. So please enter 1, 2, 3, or 4. And this is awesome, really great news. I'm seeing a lot of growth. I'm seeing mostly 3s, a few 4s, and a few 2s. So awesome, thank you. I feel like we've made some progress here, so I appreciate your input there. And remember, this is a formative assessment to us, right? We're going to be doing these webinars and we want to make sure we are presenting the best information, so we appreciate your input. Okay, the next question is, how likely are you to use this transdisciplinary real-world problems and phenomena in your teaching moving forward? Again, comparing it to what you're doing now, how would you use this pedagogical approach going forward? A, not at all. I can't possibly do it. My day is too structured. I don't have the flexibility. B would be sometimes, perhaps at the end of the unit, end of the school year, maybe in an after-school program. C would be often. I feel like this is really the type of teaching that is effective and engaging for kids. And D, all of the time. This is the framework I'm going to use going forward. I really embrace it and want to capture and use this process. So A, B, C, or D. There's a little bit of a lag, so great. So this is awesome. Again, awesome. What a great class we have here. This says often. The viewers say they're going to often use this type of method and that they really aspire to teach this. So for all of us, I want to say from the interagency working group and other federal agency representatives, we're really excited that this is something that is going to be embraced and hopefully used in the classroom. And we look forward to bringing more tools and resources for you to support that. Next question. Okay, this is a tough one. Trey listed all these pedagogical approaches that are like super cool and fun in the classroom. And we really want to drill down and find out like which one of these do you feel is the most successful in conveying this convergence education and transdisciplinary approach to your instruction. So there's a lot of acronyms. We're asking you to put the acronym only in the Q&A. And again, this helps differentiate our questions in the chat. So we've got the inquiry-based learning, entrepreneurship and innovation, project-based learning, problem-based learning, place-based learning, phenomenon-based learning, work-based learning, engineering design, career and tech ed, applied learning experiences, STEM and innovation education, STEM education for sustainability development, and or other. I guess you would put in an O for other. And then maybe your own acronym and maybe spell it out for us if you're using something different than what the ones that are listed here. So again, take a look at these and maybe it's, even if you're not using it now, which of these approaches do you think would be the most successful in applying convergence education in your classroom? All right, so we're seeing a lot of project-based experiences. Sorry, PBE is, project-based, place-based education. My apologies. Project-based learning. Let's see. Phenomena-based learning. Yeah, all these P's, all the P's in the middle. Place-based education, project-based learning, problem-based learning, phenomenon-based learning. Awesome, thank you. Yeah, some of these acronyms are new to me too, so I appreciate your consideration and applying these. Great, so we'll go to the next question. We have two more questions. Now this is an open-ended question. Just one word. If you could come up with one word, what do you think of when you hear the term convergence education? I'd love to have created a word cloud for you, and maybe we'll do it later. So think of that one word that's most descriptive of how you view convergence education. Is it fun, challenging, essential, impossible? Don't use that one. Engaging, creative, futuristic, exhausting. Yes, it definitely takes a lot of work to be so creative, but I think the payoff and seeing the kids' engagement and excitement could be worth it. Holistic, real life, essential, broad-based, relevant. Awesome. Keep them coming. In depth. Time consuming. Once you create a couple of these units, they'll be popular and you could probably reuse them. Encompassing, logical, real world. Yeah, I like these. Humanistic. Maybe global. Exciting, essential. Awesome. A lot of engaging. Yes, that's what we want, right? We want the kids engaged in order to retain the knowledge, right? All right, we have one more question, and this is really about you. Next slide, please. This, again, open-ended answer. What tools or resources would be most helpful to you in implementing convergence education in your classroom, your school, your after-school program, your museum, at home? What kind of things would be most helpful to you? So I'm thinking things like leadership support. Kelly mentioned that earlier, right? The space and the time to be messy and be so broad in your thoughts and your work. Maybe some professional development that goes a little deeper than this hour-and-a-half presentation. And then would that be virtual, or do you prefer hands-on, especially when it's, this kind of project-based instruction? You really want to make those mistakes yourself. And then what about alignment to state standards, right? Because a lot of times there's a reluctancy to do something new if it's not aligned with your standards and your assessment. So how can you, I feel like it's like double dipping or triple dipping, right? You're doing math, you're doing science, you're doing technology and engineering, you're learning about innovation, you're learning about historical precedents and the impacts on society. So I feel like convergence education and its personal bias can really address multiple standards, in the same hour, in the same class period. So I feel like you're getting double, lots of extra points, right? And then especially with respect to presentation skills, analysis, evaluation, lots of great ways to maximize on convergence education. So enough of me, what have you said? You could use some unit design, like a framework for designing the unit, some lesson plans, some checklists. I like checklists, money and time, yep. Grants, plans, virtual PD, examples from other teachers and professionals like our two stellar Einstein teachers, links, more examples, sample units. Sometimes I think material lists too, right? To keep it really inexpensive. What are the things that you could use in your classroom or could be brought in from home or the art closet? Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, these are great. Really, really appreciate your input. It's going to help us as we move forward in trying to support you and others as you think and implement on convergence education. So now it's my pleasure to, next slide, introduce my colleague, and I want to say mentor in innovation education, Dr. Jorge Valdes with the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. He's going to offer some closing remarks, some teaching resources, and field some questions that you may have for us in the audience. Again, we'll be using the Q&A, and then we'll all come back to try to respond to your questions. Thanks so much, and take it away, Jorge.
Great. Thank you so much, Patti. And wow, this is a really tough act to follow. I don't know if I can do this, but I really have, first of all, thank you to everyone. I truly have the honor and privilege of working with so many esteemed colleagues from across the federal agencies. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Trey, Dr. O'Donnell. Thank you, Patti. I also want to thank my co-leads in the Interagency Working Group on Convergence, Dr. Quincy Brown from the Office of Science and Technology Policy, Mr. Louis Lopez from the Department of Defense, and Dr. Emily Kuhn from also the Department of Defense. As Carol mentioned, we work with over 17 federal agencies across the federal government in a concerted way to really bring about new leadership and new resources and ways to help introduce, a reimagination of STEM education. I think what we heard today, I'm trying to kind of summarize with all the wonderful things that we heard today, the case for convergence and transdisciplinary learning in the classroom is truly compelling. Socrates once said, wisdom begins with wonder. And I think this has never been more true that when it comes to encouraging and inspiring our students. And I think by integrating transdisciplinary learning and teaching into your curricula, as teachers, you are challenging your students to become problem solvers, innovators, risk takers, change makers, and entrepreneurs. So I'm really excited about the potential that convergence and transdisciplinary learning has in our educational systems. We know, as a former teacher, that we work to inspire our students to use their imagination and creativity to transform their lives, their communities, their families, and industries and societies. You help them on this pathway to making new discoveries and solutions to some of our most challenging problems, as Dr. O'Donnell mentioned earlier. And I really believe convergence is no longer a nice thing to have. It's almost a must thing to have. And I'm really encouraged by some of the polling that Patti just went through, and that you told us that this is what you aspire to do in the future. So that's really awesome. We are really encouraged by your willingness to take on this. We know it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to build upon the work that started several years ago with the next generation science and engineering standards. One of the beautiful things about this, and it resonated so well with Kelly and Trey's exemplars, is that it comes to life in the classroom in so many different ways. I mean, there's a long list. Pick the pedagogy, pick the approach that you would like to use. It could be problem-based learning, project-based learning. At the US Patent and Trademark Office, where I work, we do a lot of work in innovation and invention education and intellectual property. But it can take the form of career and technical education and so on and so forth, as Trey and Kelly described so well. So next slide, please. I think we want you to know that agencies across the federal government are working very, very hard together and in a coordinated way, guided by the Federal STEM Education Strategic Plan, and especially voices from many stakeholders, including the important voices that educators bring to this important discussion about the future of STEM education. I want to highlight just a few examples of resources that federal government has available for teachers, educators. For the Smithsonian Science for Global Goals project shown here, uses transdisciplinary experiential learning, in which essentially students undertake local investigations that connects to global issues in an effective way to, again, educate, but also inspire and encourage young people. The Smithsonian Project advances K-12 STEM education for sustainable development in collaboration with the Inter-Academy Partnership, which is essentially an umbrella of, excuse me, 140 science academies around the world supporting global implementation. This project is intentionally aligned with its work with the UN Sustainable Development Goals that Dr. O'Donnell talked about earlier. The Smithsonian Science Education Center has developed a set of community research guides on 4 multifaceted subject areas like sustainable communities, food, mosquitoes, and biodiversity, each with a curriculum expected to take about 16 weeks or so. So there's a lot of free guides for youth and educators that provide locally relevant, locally driven, but globally important experiential learning experiences, which combine STEM education, social and emotional learning, and civic engagement. And I think Trey had a wonderful exemplar when he talked about the work with clothing, really inspired by that. The Department of Defense, that's comprised of tri-services, the Army, Navy, Marine Corps, and the Air Force and Space Force, as well as the department as a defense agency, such as the National Security Agency. Each of these services and agencies run STEM programs, either in their community or nationally. The Department of Defense also partners with nonprofit organizations, industry, academia, local and federal government agencies who share similar STEM missions and can reach students and educators across the nation. The work of the Department of Defense STEM, we call it DoD STEM for short, provides STEM education, outreach, and workforce development opportunities and resources across PK through 20. The website link is dodstem.us, dodstem.us, and that's the central website for these efforts. It's really a beautiful site and a launching point to discover all the many opportunities and resources that the Department of Defense has to offer. The Department of Education, I'm not going to forget Patti, who has many educational programs. So on this page, I just wanted to spotlight one of them called the Education and Innovation Research Grant. This program grant was formerly known as the I3 grant. There are 3 categories or grants that are awarded, each requiring ascending levels of evidence. The early phase grants are best suited to convergence education research, and they must demonstrate a rationale. The current fund is about $160 million, and typically Congress mandates that the Department of Education spend approximately half of that on STEM and computer science, and then the other half on social emotional learning. The fiscal year 22 applications have just closed, but all of the past awards are posted online. So go check out some of the types of projects that are being funded. Last but not least, at the USPTO's Office of Education, where I work, we are expanding our portfolio of resources and programs. Our mission is to inspire the next generation of inventors and entrepreneurs by providing the resources, the programs, the activities to support and encourage student creativity and innovation. We work really across the board with school administrators, teachers, students, parents, and organizations throughout the nation in an effort to make inventing a fun and authentic part of learning for children of all ages. Today, for example, this broadcast is being viewed by teachers from across the United States, including Alaska, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico, who are attending the USPTO's annual National Summer Teacher Institute on Innovation, STEM Education, and Intellectual Property. I'll say hello to all of my avatar teachers. Our teachers in this year's institute are attending in the metaverse. It's an avatar-based virtual reality experience where they are learning about intellectual property and how teachers can apply these concepts to foster creativity and the inventive mindset as they help prepare their students to become inventors today and future innovators and entrepreneurs. With IP concepts such as patents, trademarks, copyrights, our agency provides new pathways in convergence and transdisciplinary learning in STEM to support authentic STEM engagement and academic achievement. Please visit our website, uspto.gov/kids pages or /innovation to learn about all the wonderful resources that the USPTO can bring into your classroom. I want to mention one more. We are super thrilled about our latest project, equiphq.org. And I think it's listed on the slide here. It's a one-stop portal for educators to help your kids learn to recognize the value of their ideas and gain confidence in solving real-world problems, which has been a kind of running theme of today's session. Equip HQ is currently in its final stages of development and will soon be your invention education headquarters for everything related to intellectual property and innovation. You'll be able to play online games and activities, watch inspirational and educational videos, all while learning how you too can innovate and your students can innovate and change the world. So we're really super excited about that. These interactive teacher-approved standards-aligned resources will take students on an invention journey that introduces the concepts of intellectual property in creative ways. So I just want to sort of end with this: as you think and plan for the new school year ahead, consider exploring and bringing some of these tools and resources to inspire, to engage your students with the power that convergence and transdisciplinary learning and teaching has to offer. I want to thank all of our panelists today and thank you to all our teachers that are joining us in person or virtually from across the nation. As a former teacher, I know the important work that you do. We thank you, we celebrate each and every one of you for the work that you do each and every day. You are shaping and inspiring tomorrow's leaders and innovators that will solve some of the most pressing needs in our world. I want to thank you for your commitment to your students and to our country. We appreciate you, I appreciate you, and we are here for you. Thank you. And with that, we're going to turn over to some questions. Okay, so the first question, I'll take the first question from the audience. Thank you for the question. And the question reads, how can we better encourage and reward students for exploring cross or transdisciplinary STEAM, particularly in the second part of it, particularly when so much of the current advanced placement courses and high stakes testing are still in separated courses? What a wonderful question. Thank you for that question. I'll try to answer the first part in two parts. I think, how do we better encourage and reward students? For me, having taught physics at high school for about 10 years, I have a little bit of experience. To me, what I think is most important is student choice and student voice. And I think, at the end of the day, we all aspire to engage our students in the learning process. And I think the things that convergence and transdisciplinary learning and teaching do is to really kind of catalyze that in your students, where they take ownership of these problems and they make it, their own. And that transcends so many things. And it's wonderful to see it in practice. Trey has shown some examples of that in his classroom, and I can't wait to come to Philadelphia, Trey. We're only about an hour and a half away to see you and your students in action. The second part of this is, it is true that we are in teaching in boxes, but I think it's time to break those boxes open. It's going to require time. It's going to require professional development, as Patti mentioned, and some of the in the questions that you pose. It's going to require an opportunity for one teacher to work with another teacher in a different content area. So there's a lot of things that need to happen. Obviously, resources and the federal government can help in that regard tremendously. And we're working on that in a coordinated way, in a concerted way across federal agencies. But I'll open it up to my other esteemed colleagues here who may want to add to the question of, how do we encourage and reward students, and what do we do about, sort of breaking down the content silos that currently exist in our education.
Jorge, before we turn it over to Kelly, Patti, and Trey, one of the things I just want to reiterate is what we found in doing research around this idea is that this is not a replacement of disciplinary learning. And we know that what students learn in current AP courses is crucial foundational disciplinary knowledge that's necessary. Especially as students prepare for their college courses in which they may now engage in more transdisciplinary teaching and learning. Although I teach at the university level, and that's not necessarily the case in all courses. But I would just say that, we want to just reiterate that this is really about a pathway to convergence, that we are trying to bring students from disciplinary to multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary to transdisciplinary teaching and learning around complex socio-scientific issues. But it's not a replacement of those important foundational courses. Just wanted to reiterate that.
Yeah, thank you, Carol. That is a great point. And there's lots of fluidity that goes, from disciplinary, because you need the disciplinary, to transdisciplinary. So you're operating in multi domains really over a course of a period of teaching and learning. But Kelly, Patti, Trey?
Well, I'm intrigued by some questions here about STEAM. And I think integrating the art into STEM education is so essential in transdisciplinary learning and convergence education. It does that naturally. As these kids are focused on these compelling problems or tackling these issues, they're going to end up incorporating their skills in the arts into their solutions and in the innovation mindset. And I'm seeing a lot of questions asking about where can they find more resources for the art. There's some great resources actually from the Library of Congress. If you go to that website, some great resources and original documents that kind of have created some lessons that evaluate the art aspect within a scientific field or how to preserve art. And so that's where I would start with that question that I just saw in the chat box.
I'll jump in on that one because I saw a couple directed towards me as well regarding support or funding for STEAM. So we do have a couple programs that are designed specifically for art instruction, but there's a lot of opportunity for art integration through those programs. It includes leadership and professional development grants. But I'll talk a little bit about our other sort of STEM programs. Jorge mentioned the Education, Innovation, and Research Grant, of which half is dedicated to STEM and computer science. But I will tell you, if we got an application that was a STEAM application, we would be more than thrilled. It's not something that we would turn away because it was only STEM. So we really appreciate the integration. Oftentimes, the language will cite science, technology, engineering, or math, and we get math applications. And so we really prefer something, or at least personally prefer, more integration. And then that's a discretionary grant, right? So it's very competitive, it's research oriented. But for the rank and file teacher and administrator, I want to point to what we call Title 4A, which is a very large block grant, formula grant that goes to every school district. It's called the Student Support and Academic Enrichment Grant, and it specifically calls for supporting of well-rounded education, including computer science, STEM, computer science, and music. So there is an opportunity to, pursue STEAM-related projects through that formula grant. Again, it's Title 4A. Every state and district gets their share. So really encourage you to use that. And then I would be remiss if I didn't also mention the American Rescue Plan funds, right? These are large amounts of dollars that have been distributed to the schools and states and schools to support learning recovery. Some of it is earmarked for after school and summer learning programs. And these are opportune times to introduce STEAM and convergence activities, right? Because it's less stress about the meeting the standards and the assessment, but it's so rich and engaging for the kids. So I would just encourage folks to pursue their state American Rescue Plan funds and use those to support STEAM activities.
And Jorge, before you read the next question that's in the chat box, I wonder, just to build on Kelly and Patty's points around the A in STEM, and I know that even at the Office of Science and Technology Policy and all the work we do, we tend to use the acronym of STEM. So we're trying to integrate science, technology, engineering, and math. But I also, to build on Kelly and Patty's point, and to go back to your first question about high school, like how do you integrate this into a high school AP course, and how do you make it more transdisciplinary when it's very fundamentally, structured around particular discipline? And I would just say that find what we at the Smithsonian would consider the A is not necessarily just the arts, but access. How do you make that disciplinary content knowledge accessible to youth? How do you personalize it? How to use history, art, culture, religion, place, problems to make certain that students feel like that STEM topic or discipline is accessible to them. And so applying it to their local knowledge does make a huge difference. And we consider that A to be access. Find that access point for that discipline, and it automatically will become more transdisciplinary. So Jorge, any other questions that you're seeing in the chat?
Yeah, there's a lot of great questions. One is it talks about how does convergence education differ from what we called content integration. I think there is a challenge around the lexicon of convergence and transdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary. What we hope in a report that will soon be published by OSTP as a byproduct of the work that we have done collectively across the federal agencies, working with everyone here and many, many other esteemed colleagues, is a definition, if you will, and some exemplars around how, what this looks like, what it really is, so that we're all literally on the same page when we talk about this, and that we have clarity as we discern the different types of disciplinaries, right? Because it is confusing. Well, is this transdisciplinary? Is this multi or interdisciplinary? And so we often use these words interchangeably. And I think this report, which is eminent, I think will lend a lot of clarity to the definition.
And Jorge, I know that at the beginning we said these questions that you're helping students address, whether it's a scientific phenomenon or it's a problem, are driven by those complex socio-scientific problems and phenomena. And I think that's what differentiates this from, well, may not necessarily differentiate, but we're just trying to highlight that if you are engaged in problem-based learning or project-based learning or place-based learning, and it is based on and is driven by these complex socio-scientific problems, so deep scientific questions or deep societal needs that come together, I think that's where we think about convergence education. So Trey, I know that you were the one who shared with us all of those different types of learning, PBL, place-based learning, et cetera. How would you consider that to be different?
Yeah, I think it really is what you said. I think the other thing is I think about, I could do PBL in a science class and really only construct a scientific model of climate, right? And that's fine. There's deep learning that happens with that. but climate is also a political, a social, a psychological phenomenon, right? There's art involved in addressing climate and persuading people to make a change with climate, for instance. And so maybe my model, if you will, isn't just about the physical natural systems, but there are other components of my model where I'm really trying to figure out, how do I convince people to make a change, right? Or how do I help people not be saddened or feel gloomy about climate? How do I highlight who's actually doing something? Those are all things that start to move outside of just the scientific model. And so that's how I'm pushing myself, whether, what's the phenomenon in question? Is the phenomenon something I'm just using science to explain? Or am I actually using other tools and other lenses to help unpack the phenomenon and address it?
That's great. That's great, Trey. And Jorge, maybe one last question before we wrap up.
A lot of great questions here. I think we could go on for quite a while.
Can I jump in on
Sure,
one
go ahead,
topic? I
Patti.
think, there was some allusion to like, how do we do this, right? When we're teaching typically in silos, especially when we get to middle and high school, right? It's probably easier for elementary teachers because they have to teach it all anyway, so it doesn't matter when, and that it's easier for them to combine it. But the high school level, you might think about like a capstone course, right? That teachers must collaborate and students must now use all the knowledge and skills they've learned in presenting on, a solution to maybe this larger global or local problem. Another thing, maybe it's just to lobby your principal for more planning time, right? So that you have the opportunity to talk with your colleagues and learn what students are learning in math and science, so you can bring this all together, perhaps in a technology course where they have access to tools, to build models, et cetera. So I think, you have to really support it, behave, and work for it and lobby for it, like ask for supports. And it requires that interdisciplinary communication with your colleagues. So appreciate that question.
So I think that at this time, we only have a couple of seconds left. We just want to say, I want to say personally, thank you to my colleagues across the federal agencies, as well as Kelly and Trey, and to all of you for being here today. Thank you, Jorge, for your leadership. And, a particular acknowledgement to our other members of our working group. There are many of them. So thank you so much, everyone.